Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. So today we're unlocking a mystery that takes us way back, like over 1,000 years back, straight into the heart of early England. We're going to explore the Anglo-Saxon Futhorc. If you haven't heard of it, it's this incredibly ancient, carved writing system used by the Anglo-Saxon and Frisian peoples. If you've ever looked at those sharp, angular runes and thought, okay, but what did they actually sound like? What did they mean? Where did they even come from? Well, you are in the exact right place. We're going to decode these runes together. Okay, let's dive into this, because this is wild. Out of roughly 5 centuries of vibrant history, active use, and just everyday life, fewer than 200 authentic Futhorc artifacts survive today. I mean, just let that sink in for a second. 200. That is it. These runic inscriptions are incredibly rare remnants of a completely lost writing tradition, barely surviving on these tiny fragments of stone, bone, and metal. And that makes every single one of them a really precious window into the Old English language and the minds of the people who spoke it.
So here's our roadmap for today. First, decoding the Anglo-Saxon runes. Second, their origins in the Elder Futhorc. Third, expanding for Old English. Fourth, meaning, magic, and artifacts. And finally, the shift to Latin.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, decoding the Anglo-Saxon runes. First off, you might be wondering, what does the word Futhorc actually even mean? Well, just like the word alphabet comes from the first 2 Greek letters, alpha and beta, the name Futhorc literally just comes from the phonetic values of its first 6 runes. F, U, Th, O, R, and C. Put them together, and you get Futhorc. Simple as that. This was the go-to writing system used in Britain and Frisia way before the Latin alphabet truly took over the scene. Now, you'll immediately notice the distinct, highly angular look of these letters. There are practically 0 horizontal lines or curves. And why is that? Well, before ink and parchment were brought over by the Christian church, these letters are meant to be physical. They were literally carved into objects using knives. Straight, vertical, and diagonal lines are just way easier to cut across the grain of wood or scratch into metal and stone without completely splintering the material. Makes total sense, right?
Moving right along to Section 2, origins in the Elder Futhorc.
Now, what's really interesting about this is that the Futhorc didn't just appear out of thin air. It evolved from an even older 24-character runic alphabet known as the Elder Futhorc. That one had deep Co-Germanic roots and was used all across Northern Europe. But as migrating tribes started settling in Frisia and Britain, they took those original 24 letters and, well, they stretched them. In its early form, the Anglo-Saxon Futhorc grew to 28 characters and eventually expanded to between 33 and 34 characters. Which brings us to Section 3, expanding for Old English. So why exactly did the Anglo-Saxons need to invent all these extra letters? Why wasn't the original 24-letter Elder Futhorc enough for them? The answer really comes down to the sheer complexity of the Old English language. Old English was incredibly phonetically rich. It was just packed with unique vowel sounds and complex diphthongs, which, if you're not familiar, are essentially 2 vowel sounds gliding together in the same syllable. The original 24 Germanic runes simply did not have enough characters to accurately write down all the distinct sounds these people were speaking on a daily basis. They absolutely needed a more nuanced script. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how they solved that problem. Take the original Elder Futhorc rune Ansus, which basically represented a standard A sound. To accommodate the changing, complex phonetics of English, that single old rune literally split into 3 distinct new runes. You got Ak for an A sound, Ask for an A sound like an ash, and Os for an O sound. It's so clever. They took the existing framework and just adapted it perfectly to fit their native tongue. Next up, Section 4, meaning, magic, and artifacts. But here's the thing, these weren't just sterile phonetic tools. They carried some incredibly deep symbolic weight in everyday Anglo-Saxon life. Every single rune in the Futhorc had a specific name, and that name carried a distinct meaning, grounded in nature, mythology, and just daily survival. For example, the first rune, Fio, didn't just make an F sound. It actually stood for wealth, or cattle. Ur meant aurochs, which was this fierce wild ox, symbolizing strength, and thorn literally meant a sharp thorn plant. So a single carved mark could condense this huge conceptual message into a really tiny space. And the craziest part? We actually know these meanings in great detail today, thanks to the Old English rune poem. Composed around the 10th century, this poem served as an incredible memory aid. It dedicated a full stanza to each of the 29 runes of the standard alphabet used at that time. You can see a rough translation of the stanza for that first rune, feel, linking the concept of wealth directly to the earth. It really gives you a sense of how they viewed the world. And of course, we don't just have poetry, we have the runes carved into real-world objects. The Sex of Beagnoth, for instance, is this 9th century knife that is incredibly special because it bears the only known physical inscription of the complete 28-letter alphabet sequence. Then there's the Franks casket, which is the stunning 8th century whalebone chest absolutely covered in runic riddles and scenes ranging from Roman myth all the way to Germanic legends like Wayland the Smith. And we can't forget the Ruthwell cross, a massive stone monument running vertical runic verses of the poem The Dream of the Rood right down its sides. So the crucial point here is that runes were deeply integrated into the society. They didn't just immediately vanish the second Christianity arrived on the scene. Take the inscription found on a bone comb from Whitby, dating to around 670 AD. It reads, Deus meus, God Allewaldo, helpes cipe, which means, my God, Almighty God, help me. Think about that. It is a Latin Christian prayer, carved entirely in what was originally a pagan runic script. For centuries, these two cultures coexisted. There was also a lingering belief in rune magic, which is fascinating. The historian Bede actually tells this famous anecdote about a prisoner named Imma, whose chains kept mysteriously falling off. His captors were so freaked out, they actually asked him if he was using magical loosening letters or rune staves to break his binds. On top of that, we found 9th and 10th century bloodstone rings engraved with runic formulas meant to staunch bleeding, and even burial urns with mirrored spiegel runes that suggest they were used as protective charms. Finally, we arrive at Section 5, the shift to Latin. As Latin scriptoria, basically monastic writing rooms, grew more dominant in England, these two alphabets began to mix right there on the parchment page. Because runes each had a specific word associated with them, clever scribes started using them as space-saving ideograms. For example, in the sole surviving manuscript of the epic poem Beowulf, you can literally see the rune for man written right into the Latin text as a quick shorthand abbreviation for the word man. It was basically an early version of texting shorthand. Let's move to the timeline and see how this all builds. The Futhorc originates and really takes hold around the 5th century. By the 7th century, Christian missionaries introduced the Latin alphabet, and that begins to compete for dominance, especially in official and religious texts. Now, the runic script holds on for a few more centuries in everyday and monumental carvings, but by the 11th century, accelerated by the Norman conquest of 1066, common knowledge of the Futhorc largely fades away into an archaic curiosity. But here is the brilliant twist. The Futhorc didn't vanish without a trace, not at all. The Latin alphabet actually had a major flaw when it came to writing Old English. It did not have letters for the th sound or the w sound. So the early English scribes simply took two runes straight out of the Futhorc, thorn and win, and absorbed them directly into the early Latin script. They lived on for centuries in English writing just to cover the specific sounds the Romans couldn't handle. Which leaves us with this final thought. How do the ghosts of the Futhorc still live in the English we speak today? Well, next time you write or say a word like the, that, or thorn, think about the th sound you're making. You are literally speaking the ghost of the Futhorc. The runic thorn may have eventually been replaced by a T and an H on the printing press, but the phonetic legacy of these carved, ancient lines is still hiding right there in the everyday English we speak right now. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and definitely keep looking for the history hidden in plain sight.